Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. This week I wanted to share some thoughts on mental health and the way it relates to stress. So the way we tend to think about mental health in the kind of Western healthcare system is in terms of categories, right? You have the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, which is used to classify different mental health issues, and whether or not you kind of meet that binary classification determines whether or not you get care, basically, whether you're allowed to access different services in mental health care systems. So this way of thinking, it's conceptual, right? You have these boundaries where you have the concept of something like depression, and either you have it or you don't have it. And so this fits with a very generally kind of symbolic or conceptual way of thinking, in which we also think of ourselves as being a static self. So instead of seeing the world as a complex process, we say, no, I am a static self. I am James. When I was born, I was James. When I die, I'll be James. And there's some unchanging essence there. And if I have an issue like depression, then James has depression. There are these kind of static categories, these symbols that we use, and they can really obscure an understanding of what's going on and what underlies the suffering associated with these issues. So with something like depression, we see this very widely, that often people feel they have no real insight into why they're depressed. They don't really understand why they're suffering. They might look at their life, they might say they have a great job, great relationship, they like where they live, but for some reason they're in this kind of mental anguish. And by diagnosing people and just saying, at a certain point you have this issue, before then we don't need to think about what might have led up to it. You have this issue now, and that way of thinking leads us into kind of, or it fits with reductionist ways of thinking, where you can give an answer like, you have low serotonin. This for the longest time was this meme that was shared about depression, in part because it made a lot of money for pharmaceutical industries, but it's a very understandable, very simple story. You've got these pills that increase serotonin level generally, so maybe the cause of depression is low serotonin, this very physical issue that has absolutely nothing to do with your general well-being, your general happiness, how stressed you are, how the world is treating you. All of that stuff is divorced from this supposed cause of an issue like depression. So this is one way of thinking. And then when you have a mystical experience and you go from thinking in terms of concepts, concepts like the self and all of these narratives, when you let go of that, you realize that reality is a single process and that you are as well. And then there's a particular perspective in science called dynamical systems that really fits with this way of thinking. So when I talk about kind of scientific explanations for things, often it might be in terms of thermodynamics or networks or these kind of dynamical systems, and that's because we're looking at things as kind of holistic, large-scale interactions rather than kind of solid, static symbols or essences. So when we think about mental health from this kind of dynamical systems perspective, we have to think about what we are, right? So we are these living systems, and we're systems that perpetuate their form, keep themselves together over time in a universe that tends towards disorder and messiness. So there's this fundamental stress or kind of existential anxiety built into what we are. Imagine if there's a kind of a hurricane that stumbled on a way to perpetuate itself forever, and it kept doing this. Well, it would develop a psychology very much like our own, where there's an incentive to keep itself going, because that's the entire thing that it is, if that makes sense. It is a self-perpetuating system, and it can only do that by acting in such a way as to be preoccupied with self-perpetuation. So in systems like us, we have this fundamental stress. We don't want to die. We don't want to be harmed. that is at the core of what we are as self-perpetuating systems, because all of those things are synonymous with us no longer perpetuating our form. Now, there's no kind of grand objective reason that we should perpetuate our form. It's just this little kind of dance that we started doing and kind of that defines what we are. And to realize that, it can be really liberating, because you realize that death isn't objectively bad. It's just bad from the perspective of a living system like us. And so it's only on that level. It's only on the level of our own concerns as living systems that death matters. It doesn't matter in an absolute sense. But for living systems like us, there is this stress. There is this fear that we'll come to harm, that death is inevitable, because we really are going against the trend of the larger scale of reality that's moving towards increased entropy and disorder. So stress is kind of a necessary feature of life, and trauma is when something stressful, something that challenges our integrity, our ability to flourish and perpetuate our form, when something challenges that in a way that's overwhelming. So, if you almost get hit by a vehicle and you almost die, but you don't, that could be a kind of traumatic event where you realize that, or your brain kind of reacts in such a way as it realizes that you need to really learn from this event. You almost died, and that is unacceptable from the kind of game that we're doing as living things. So you really need to be more hypervigilant, more anxious, more on edge to make sure you detect these threats in future. And so that's a kind of an acute, isolated incident that can produce trauma. But you can also have trauma from ongoing chronic stress. If you were kidnapped and kept somewhere for years, you're constantly in a hypervigilant state, trying to see if you can escape, or just feeling the stress of isolation, of being disempowered. And that can also leave similar kind of effects on us. Not to mention, kind of when we're very young, emotional attachment is so important that what may seem like mild levels of neglect can also lead to kind of to what's called complex or developmental trauma. So you have this picture in which this existential stress and trauma as a way of talking about when that stress becomes too much. You have those as the kind of key components in this system's perspective of what we are and how mental suffering relates to that. And I should also say the living mirror theory provides that link. It provides the link between understanding what we are as these kind of these living systems that are trying to perpetuate their form, and why that subjectively feels like something to be afraid of death, to not want to die, to feel suffering when there's pain, something that damages your physical body. Because it's showing how you can think of subjective states as arising from this dynamic. So I've mentioned already how, to address the main topic here of mental health and this existential stress that we face as living systems, I've mentioned trauma, and the example of almost dying in a vehicle accident. That's a situation where you can see why trauma would arise, because you need to learn from this experience. You're always trying to keep an eye on threat levels, and if you fail to do that, if something's happened that you've not anticipated, you really need to learn from that. So your models are going to constantly try to update themselves by replaying the event, seeing what can be learned from it. So you get these kind of flashbacks in PTSD. Now, you could also have, if it's not kind of acute traumatic events like that, you could have anxiety. Now anxiety is clearly related to stress. It is a kind of generalized stress response. If someone appears threatening to you, you should feel a level of anxiousness, kind of level of stress and tension, and kind of shallow breathing, ready to respond. It's a kind of fight or flight state to be in. But if you generalize that to situations that are not dangerous, like seeing a friend well, if you have kind of social anxiety, even in that situation, there's a kind of an oversensitization. You've generalized to situations where you don't need, objectively, you're not unsafe, you don't need to feel stressed. And so it's similar with the PTSD thing. presumably in these cases, it could be early life experience, but some things led you to be hypervigilant, that's led you to think or to function in such a way as you need to be on edge because you don't actually feel safe. So when I say you don't need to feel stressed in that particular instance, it doesn't mean that in the big picture of your life, there's always some reason that you are responding the way you are. People don't just suffer for the sake of it. There'll be something in the history that leads someone to behave in this way because it feels necessary to be on edge socially, even if they know intellectually that this person's safe, experientially and in an embodied way, which these memories are stored in different circuits in the brain. They'll feel unsafe in a kind of instinctive way, and you can't, the cortex, where you kind of have the more intellectualized kind of models that can't just kind of go down to these deep kind of primal levels of the brain and just rewrite those memories, which is why it's often necessary to kind of go into them experientially and in an embodied way and kind of feel the feelings in the body to process them. And actually that's a way where the cortex and the hippocampus that stores memories, those systems can almost kind of observe the process of the emotions being felt in the body and then store them in the kind of the narrative. So this is the process of bringing to awareness that underlies a lot of this healing. You have this anxiety, you don't know where it comes from, you have a psychedelic experience, for example, you feel the stress in your body and you associate it with a certain memory, and then the cortex and the hippocampus that are more to do with our conscious narrative of ourselves can witness what's going on there and can store it into your narrative. So instead of reacting to things and not knowing why, just feeling incredibly anxious without having the insight, instead you can go into a state where you feel anxious, but it's because of certain traumas or certain things that happened early in life. So that's PTSD and anxiety, which clearly have a basis in stress. But in something like you have a bunch of issues that also relate to, I would say they relate to coping with stress. So something like addiction, right? If you have a kind of addiction to alcohol, a good way to understand what's going on there, there's a model where we're told it's just a physical thing. It's a chemical hook that the kind of chemical compound does something in the brain that hijacks the reward system. There is an aspect of that in the sense that certain things are more addictive than others. It's hard to get addicted to vegetables, for example, because they don't kind of hijack the dopamine system in that way. So there is that aspect to it. But someone who is incredibly emotionally grounded and not stressed would not be as susceptible to addiction. So whereas if you're living with incredible amounts of stress and you need to kind of go from this state of feeling stressed out, you want to feel this sense of being grounded and at peace. Something that hits that reward system, like alcohol, can take you there. And so it's a kind of artificial way to try and make you feel like everything's okay, even for a short period. And then you'll go back to the state of being stressed out, and usually there'll be kind of side effects that can make the stress worse, which leads people to seeking the soothing effects of the substance more. So this can lead to this kind of feedback of addiction. But it's important to realize that there is this emotional stress-related component to it typically. And if you don't address that, and you try to just, address addictions through willpower alone, then you're only looking at half of the picture. And then obviously other things that relate to kind of a sense of control, things like obsessive compulsive disorder, where you may just develop rituals that help you to gain a sense of control. So if you think of superstitions and kind of mythologies that humans had for most of their history, if you're living in this world that with forces you don't understand, it makes sense to come up with myths. Something like that lightning is Thor striking his anvil with his hammer. These kinds of stories allow people to feel so they have some sense, for what's going on in the world. So if lightning strikes your village and it burns down, instead of saying, like, nature doesn't care about us and is unpredictable and you can just die suddenly, it's more soothing and calming to say, okay, Thor was angry with us, let's figure out why. And it prompts you to do some kind of introspection, but it makes you feel like there's some sense of control you have. Seems to be a similar thing with delusions, like in psychosis, where you get to a point where you're so stressed. It may not always be stress, but sometimes there's usually a kind of stressful event that precipitates psychosis. And so you're so stressed that you just shift into a state of delusion where you think, I need to change my models of the world, and even if they're not accurate, it'll make me feel better to feel like I've got I know what's going on. If I feel stressed and I don't know why, that's kind of more stressful because you feel out of control. Whereas if you come up with a delusion that you're being followed, for example, then there's a good reason to think that you're stressed, and so that provides some kind of provides a kind of soothing function. We spoke about this kind of thing in my episode with Ari Brower on pivotal mental states. So with something like OCD, you're engaging in kind of ritualistic routines that are similar to performing kind of religious rituals in a kind of superstitious way, thinking that it will have some effect on the world, but both serve this kind of soothing function. There's also an interesting side note. It seems to be something that's not just a human thing, this kind of superstitious ritualistic behavior. There was a study where scientists got rats to, all they had to do was press a lever to get, I think it was like a food pellet or some water or some kind of reward, but there was a delay. So instead of getting it immediately, they had to wait a few seconds, and that was it. And what they found is that the rats would do a kind of a little dance basically in the kind of waiting period, and so it seems a bit like they press the lever. Imagine the first time they're kind of looking towards the left, and then they turn around a little bit towards the right. It seems they pick up on these patterns and they kind of superstitiously reenact it, because on some level, because the world is unpredictable, you don't actually know for certain that it was the lever press that produced the food coming out. It may have been any of the other things you did. So you kind of ritualistically, superstitiously do all these kind of movements. It may have been that the food didn't come out every time. That might make more sense if there was some randomness to it, because it produces that uncertainty. But it's almost like how different tennis players will have a little kind of routine where they'll kind of touch their face in a particular way, bounce the ball a certain number of times. It seems to be something, that mammals do when there's uncertainty in the kind of goal they're trying to achieve. So this is, I think, how issues like OCD relate to stress. It's an attempt to kind of get some control over your stress levels by feeling like you have some control over the world or some insight into it. And this whole kind of way of thinking, it seemed to, we don't live in a culture that encourages us to think in terms of general well-being based in stress. If you think that way, you tend to, you might find something like meditation useful, something where you're trying to be as grounded as possible in the present, and through being present in a non-stressed way, that really is, as far as I can see, that is the goal of existence, is to be truly present, truly living every moment and not distracted, lost in models, lost in kind of goal-directed thinking in this kind of stressed out way. And for the vast majority of human history, it seems that we didn't live in the mode that we now live in. So post-agriculture, we suddenly live in a mode where there's a lot of goal-directed planning going on. There's a whole mode of thinking that we need to do X, Y, and Z for the goal of having enough food. And then that transmutes into the goal of having power to kind of coerce people by having enough food to get them to do things for you. And so over the last several thousand years, we're now in a position where this is our culture. It's very embedded in our global culture. This attitude of just keep going, keep keep functioning in the system as much as you can until you break, and then when you break, we'll give you a diagnosis, and hopefully we can give you a nice simple solution that doesn't require us to center you and empower you and pay attention to you and really, encourage you to live a fulfilling life, but can just get you back into the system of wealth production. And I think what we ideally would need is a shift back towards those kind of hunter-gatherer values of being present, living in community, taking care of each other. It's hard to see how we're going to get there, but that would be my hope. So if we go back to something like depression, it may seem less obvious as to how depression relates to this issue of stress, but for about half a century now, there have been models of depression, probably longer actually, that are based in some sense in stress. So one is learned helplessness. There are these studies where, I think it was in Russia, where they had dogs that they basically gave electric shocks to, and one dog could either jump over a wall to escape the shocks, and the other one couldn't. And the one that couldn't seemed to show behaviours that you might class as depression, kind of lethargy, loss of interest in eating, and this idea is that when you're in this world where you need to achieve your goal of self-perpetuation, and when you're frustrated in those attempts, when you lose control, that's a highly stressful state to be in. It's like I said, with being kidnapped, it's inherently stressful to be disempowered in that way. And depression, under this view, reflects effectively a giving up. It's like another strategy where the strategy is reduce your metabolism, lay low effectively, approximate kind of hibernation until circumstances might change. So if you were kidnapped and you really exhausted all of your ways that you might be able to get out of the situation, it might make sense for you to just kind of do as little as possible. Don't move, don't psychologically get your hopes up about anything, just kind of sink into this waking hibernation, and see if after a certain amount of time something happens. Maybe someone comes and realizes what's going on, and circumstances might change. And I think this is kind of a powerful way of thinking about depression, and it's very complex when it comes to humans because we're very complex creatures. But this also relates to social defeat as another model people use for depression, where animals, if they're kind of dominated by other animals, they seem to show these kinds of depressive symptoms, and it's very stressful to be at the bottom of a kind of a hierarchy, where you're not empowered to kind of do what you need to do. It might mean you get less access to food and other kind of things that are necessary for survival, and that's inherently stressful. So in this picture, depression is a response to the way we're navigating life under these stressful conditions, and it also accounts for why people often have kind of psychosomatic issues that go along with issues like depression and anxiety. I myself had kind of skin-related conditions, eczema and breathing issues. All of these kind of physical issues were associated with mental health issues because of their origin in this stress response that ultimately can be understood in terms of trauma. And so if we also touch on psychosis, I mentioned earlier how when we were talking about OCD that I think we can really understand psychosis in this model as well, of when stress gets too much, that you just need to throw out the way you've been navigating the world and update it with new models, because it's better to have, well, clearly the initial approach wasn't working, so you should try something new, and even if the models are faulty and delusional, it can be reassuring to you, and you can just kind of tailor make them to fit the data, which is kind of more reassuring, makes you feel like you really have an explanation for everything, and therefore have some intellectual control over it, even if you don't have physical control over it. And then when it comes to kind of healing of this stuff, I think psychedelics really help us because they can really allow you to feel the stress. So with something like LSD in particular, you might really be put in touch with a very kind of activated, slightly stressed out feeling. And if you allow yourself to feel those feelings instead of denying them, instead of trying to suppress them and just get on with your life, that allows them to be brought to awareness, allows them to be kind of reprocessed in the brain, transferred from these the more ancient areas into the areas to do with your kind of conscious narrative. And actually, I mean, feeling in an embodied way is really crucial to get into these circuits, because without that you can't just kind of use your symbolic thought to extract these memories. You can't think your way out of it. And when you're doing this, it's important that you don't get into a kind of feedback loop of kind of anxiety that could produce a panic attack. Instead, you need to be grounded in the present. Your breathing needs to be slow and relaxed. So this is where something that I really didn't appreciate until I engaged with kind of psychedelic healing is the way that we can really empower ourselves with a bunch of different resources to take control of our well-being. So when you're in this stressed out state under a psychedelic, what are you going to do? You could sit there and just be more and more stressed out. You could wait, you may just wait for the experience to follow its own course. But another thing you could do is to actively resource yourself with ways to reduce your stress levels. So for me, this was learning to breathe in a relaxed way. That really reduces stress. Being out in nature is something that also is it's more aligned with our evolved characteristics, so it kind of brings us into a state of relaxation. And whatever it is, meditation, yoga, all of these things are ways to take kind of active control of your stress levels and engage with them. And I think combining it with psychedelic therapy is a really powerful way to get into this kind of core material that underlies our physical and mental health, and to take control of it. And it's necessary because we're not these kind of abstract, floaty thoughts, where Western medicine tends to think of us as this kind of body with this disembodied mind, and for some reason sometimes the mind becomes depressed and we don't really understand why. Instead, we are these real embodied living systems navigating a world with real consequences for our survival, even if it doesn't feel like it imminently, because we're so intelligent that we can really see far-reaching consequences. If someone socially slights us, that could have implications for our ability to survive in kind of hunter-gatherer societies. We're smart enough to anticipate really long-term consequences like that, but we're not smart enough to realize that it's no longer relevant in the world that we live in today. I kind of feel like with agriculture as well, we're just smart enough to do stupid things as a creature. Something that seems really clever in the short term, but actually has lots of unforeseen consequences. That's a side issue. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been interesting. Take care.